This video is brought to you by Envato. I've always been fascinated by 3D design. Ever since I was a kid and I started playing Heretic, I dreamed of bringing ideas to life in 3 dimensions. It seemed like the ultimate way to create shapes, textures, lights, and even animations all in one place. But every time I tried it myself, I felt like I was hitting a wall. 3D design software looked like a puzzle. Then one day I stumbled upon Spline. It made 3D design feel a lot less like rocket science and a lot more like something I can actually do. In this course, I'll take you on the same journey, showing you how to bring your own 3D ideas to life. No matter your experience level, you'll discover how simple and powerful it can be. Hey everyone, I'm Adi, and in this course I will teach you the basics of Spline, and we'll keep things very simple and very practical. That means minimal theory and lots of exercises. In the first lesson, we'll cover 3D modeling. We'll talk about the difference between 2D and 3D objects. We'll work with parametric objects like cubes and spheres, and we'll create a 3D keycap, a table and chair set, and a snowman. The second lesson is about materials. I'll show you how to use the Spline library, but also how to create your own materials. And we'll be creating a colorful Rubik's Cube and a very metallic, very shiny robot head. The next lesson covers lighting and how to use the different types of light in Spline to create a cool looking 3D scene. To demonstrate that, I'll be using this super cool looking 3D rocket that I got from Envato. And finally, we'll talk about animations and interactions. Here we'll create 3 very cool scenes. We'll build a 3D loader where you'll learn how to use state-based animations. Then we'll take our shiny robot head and make it follow our mouse cursor. And finally, we'll take the 3D keycap we made in the first lesson and turn it into an interactive mini keyboard that responds to user input. And of course, you'll learn how to navigate the 3D space and also how to use the Spline interface to get things done. So without further ado, let's get moving and start by learning the basics of 3D modeling. Before you start creating 3D stuff, it's important to understand the difference between 2D and 3D, right? Between 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So think about drawing on a piece of paper. The paper itself is a 3D object because it has a width, a height, and a certain thickness. So it exists in all 3 dimensions. The drawing, however, is 2D because it only exists on the flat surface of the paper, right? The drawing has no depth, it has no thickness, even if you sketch something that looks like it has a perspective. Once you add depth to something, then you're working with all 3 dimensions. And Spline is no different. You can work with both 2D and 3D objects within that 3-dimensional space. And a cool thing you can do in Spline is transform a 2D object into a 3D object by giving it depth. So let me show you what that's all about. So I have a new Spline document here, and I'm going to start by drawing a rectangle. So I can press R on my keyboard or select the rectangle tool from the toolbar on the top. And I can just click and drag. I can even hold down Shift to make it a square. One thing I can do is right click and all the way here at the bottom, reset position. That's going to put it exactly in the middle of my document. So this rectangle is a 2D object because it has a width and it has a height. And this is represented on the 2 axes. And you can see the shape size right here on the right side in the inspector. And I can always change those values to something else if I want to. Now, I say this is a 2D object because it doesn't have depth. It doesn't have any kind of thickness to it. So in Spline, I can hold Shift and the mouse wheel to orbit around my scene, right? So Shift and then click and hold the mouse wheel. And I can change from the front view that we had earlier to a 3D perspective. So now we're seeing this 2D object from another perspective. And I can use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. And by looking at it from this angle, you can clearly see that this is not a 3D object because it misses that depth. But in Spline, it's really easy to add the depth to any 2D object. So you can click to select, and then in the inspector, you can enter a value for the extrusion. Let's say 10. You can also use the slider here. And by doing that, you're adding a third dimension to that object. You're adding depth. And depth is represented by the blue axis, the Z axis. So now this is a proper 3D object because it exists in all three dimensions. It has a width, it has a height, and it has depth. Now, let's practice working on this 3D space by creating and modeling a 3D keycap. This video is brought to you by Envato, the unlimited creative subscription. Find and download high-quality 3D renders, models, and templates. Follow the link in the description and start creating now. Now, for our 3D keycap, we're starting again with a brand new document here in Spline, and we'll be using something called parametric objects. And parametric objects can be added from the toolbar by clicking the plus sign and selecting one of these. Cube, sphere, cylinder, torus, helix. So you can think of these like pre-made 3D objects. So if you select cube, for instance, and you add it, that's going to create a cube. If you create a sphere, yeah, that's going to add a sphere. And a torus is basically a big donut. And there are a couple of others. A cone is really what you would expect. So these are called parametric objects, and they're called like that because they're objects that always retain their original parameters after being modified. And don't worry if that doesn't make any sense right now. It will once we start playing around with them. So let's create a 3D keycap. The keycap is basically like a cube, but the top face is a little bit narrower, right? It has a text on it. Usually it has these rounded corners. And on some of the keys, like for instance this one, there is a slight curve on the surface of the keycap, so it it accommodates the fingertips a little bit better. So let's go ahead and create something similar. And in Spline, I start with a brand new document. And by default, Spline gives us a rectangle right here in the middle, but we don't need that. This right here is a directional light. Don't worry about this. We'll talk about the lights in a future chapter. But right now, I want to start the process by creating a cube. So I'm going to select the cube. From the top here, just click anywhere to position it in my 3D space. Then right-click and reset its position so it's right in the middle. So now if we orbit, we can see that 3D cube being placed exactly in the middle. Now, I'm going to switch my view here from orthographic to perspective. And that's going to make things look a little bit more natural. Orthographic, the orthographic view is mostly used for, technical drawings and scenes and stuff like that. For the kind of things that we'll be creating, I'm always going to use perspective. This has no impact on the objects themselves. It's just a different way of seeing things for us. Now, with the cube selected, I'm just going to remove the corner radius there, the roundness, and also just bring these down just so it's as square as possible. And then I'm going to click on this button here, Smooth and Edit. Now, Smooth and Edit is going to allow us to model that cube. And I'm going to start by changing this subdivision modifier here. I'm going to set it to 4. So we're starting with kind of a sphere or a spherical shape. And the way we're going to model this is by adding divisions. Now, here's what I mean by that. Once we got into the edit mode here for the object, and by the way, we can always double click outside and we can exit edit mode. But if we go into edit mesh here, we have 3 selection modes right here on the top. Face allows me to select any of the faces. Edge allows me to select any of the lines or edges. And a vertex allows me to select any of the points. And a 3D object is basically made up of these 3 things. Now, I can use something called loop cut to add a division in my shape. So this automatically kind of snaps to the middle of things. So let me add a division vertically like this. So I'm going to click. And now we can see that that object is no longer a sphere, but is instead like a cylinder. So now I can take, or I can use another tool called Edge Slide to take this and move it up. And you can see how this affects our shape. Right? I can move it, of course, up or down, but in this case, I want to move it up. And just like that, I've created like a very deep bowl or a cup. But let's go one step further. Let's create another cut in here or another division. Edge slide, and we'll bring this down. Now, let's create some more divisions. Let's create one vertical, another one vertical in the half part there, and another one. Okay. And now let's do it the other way around. Let's make one here, and one here, and one here. So now basically I have a cube that's rounded on the top and bottom parts. And also the edges here are also slightly rounded because of this division here. Now, here's what I can do. I can go to a front view and I can select the vertex, just click and drag over all of these, and just make sure that all of the points or all of the vertex or vertices, I guess they're called, all of these are selected, even the ones in the back. And by using the controls here, I can make them smaller. So click and hold down Shift to make them smaller. So now it's starting to look like our keycap, but it's a little bit too tall. So let's click on the green arrow and let's move this further down to something like that. Right, so that looks roughly like our keycaps. Cool. Now let's also add that slight curve here in the top part. So we can double click to enter edit mode. And again, I'm going to use this control here to get me a front view. And then using the V tool or to select the vertex or the points, I'm going to select these 3 sets. And I'm just going to bring them down slightly. And then select this, the middle ones, and bring them down as well. So now if we take a closer look, we can see how this is shaping up. And if we want to make this shape even more refined, yeah, I can add more divisions. And the more divisions I have, the bigger the detail will be on the actual model. But I think for now, that's looking just fine. So just like that, we've created a 3D keycap, which is wider at the base, yeah, narrower on the top side, and it has rounded edges, and it also has this nice rounded surface here. All right, let's move on to our next exercise, which is a table and chair set. Now, in this exercise, we'll be working with transformations, like moving and rotating objects in 3D space, but we'll start with a brand new spline file. So let's just delete this rectangle. Let's change the view to perspective. And I'll do something a little bit different on this one. In the inspector, you can see our scene has a background color, which we can change to whatever we want. So let's actually change it to a lighter color. We'll go with a kind of a pink theme for this model. And I'm also going to create a plane, which will act as a floor for our 3D model. This is optional, but it's going to allow us to see how the objects we're creating are interacting with the light that we have here. And this directional light is positioned there by default in any new spline document. So let's go ahead and create or select plane, and we'll just create a really big plane. Let's make it like 2000 by 2000, and we'll reset its position like so. And then in the layers panel here, we can lock it so it doesn't interfere with any of our other objects. And one last thing, I want to select this plane, and in the inspector, I want to change its color to something else, to something like this. Okay, now let's start with our table. So if we think about it, a table is made up of a tabletop and 4 legs, right? In its most basic form. So let's start with the tabletop. So let's actually start by drawing a rectangle. And we're going to make it about, let's say, 100 as the X here. And let's say 200 as the Y. So that looks like a normal size for a table. Now I'm going to extrude it. Let's do like 20 or maybe a bit less. Something like 12. Or even less, maybe like 8. Yeah. And by doing that, I just gave it thickness, basically. And let's go ahead and change its color. If we go to the material section here, we can change its color to something else so we can see it a little bit better. Now let's right click and reset its position and just bring it up a touch. Now, just by doing that and by adding our floor, we can see shadows, right? So the light that's right there, yeah, that's casting a shadow under this table. And if I move it in any other direction, the shadow moves along with it. That's pretty cool. Now let's add some roundness to the edges here. We can do that with the bevel. All right, I'm just going to add 1 to the bevel there. And for the bevel size, just to add a little bit more detail, let's go with like 4. And maybe we can increase the bevel to 2. Is that too much? That's probably a bit too much. So let's go back to 1. And let's also make these corners these corners here rounded. So I'm just going to add maybe 4 to the rounded corners. Cool. So that's the tabletop. Now let's create the legs. And the legs are what? They're basically very elongated cubes. So let's draw a rectangle and let's make it, let's say 12 by 12 is actually okay. And let's extrude it. And we'll add maybe like 64 for the extrusion. And let's actually change the size to 8 by 8. Okay, that looks pretty good. Let's also bevel, increase the bevel size here, and let's do a little bit of a corner to make these look a little bit more polished. And as for the color, we'll set it to this value here, FB CC DC. Nice. Now, let's go ahead and duplicate this. So I can select it and then Control D to duplicate it. And that's going to create a copy exactly in its place, which I can then move around. And then I can select these two, Control D. That's going to create 2 copies, which I can move wherever I want. Now, let's go ahead and align these to the very edges of my tabletop. To do that, to make it simpler for us, let's go back in the inspector and we'll turn on snapping, the snapping feature. By default, it's set to off, but you can set it to snap to the grid, which is the, the lines that you see here on the floor, or to the object. We're going to select object. That means I can select this leg, for instance, and I can move it around and it's going to automatically snap so that it's perfectly aligned with the other objects, either on the center or on the edge, right? So if let's actually move this around a little bit. There. So now that's aligned exactly on the same edge. It might look a little bit off because this corner here is rounded, but I guarantee it's aligned precisely. Now let's do the same with these. And these. And finally with this. And by the way, you can select 2 objects and you can actually align them using various axes. But in this case, doing this visually is much more simple. Okay, so with the legs positioned exactly at the edges, I want to now move them towards the inside of the table, right? To create a sort of inset, basically. So I'm going to take this, select the first object, and I'm going to check out its position here. So what axis are we working with? If I move this around and I look at the inspector, it changes the X axis, okay? So I can actually do math operations in here. If I say plus 20, it's going to move that 20 units. But that's a bit too much. So let's do plus 8. And plus 8 is just fine. Let's move it to the inside as well. And that changes the Z-axis. So here I'm going to do plus 8. That's going to move it that way. So now let's do the same for the others. This one, also the Z-axis, we're going to add 8 there. And we're going to add, or we're going to subtract 8 on the X-axis because I want to bring it this way towards the center of the table. This one here, same thing. The X is going to be minus 8. And the Z this time is going to be plus 8. Or sorry, also minus 8. We'll do -16 to bring it in. And this one, -8 and +8. Great. So now these are positioned correctly in terms of their spacing in relation to the tabletop edges, but they're on the wrong side of the table, right? They should be under the table, not above. We created them above because I wanted to make it simpler for us. But now what we can do is select all of them and we can move them down. And now we can orbit around and use the scroll wheel to zoom, and also pan around our scene by clicking and holding the mouse wheel. And I can, change the vertical position until the snapping is activated and the top of each leg is perfectly flush with the bottom of the tabletop, if that makes any sense. So now this is our finished table. So now I can take it and I can move it down until it touches that floor, until it snaps to it. Now let's create the chair. So for the chair, I want to create like a circular stool, I guess you could call it. So let's start with the ellipse tool. And I'm going to draw an ellipse that's about that much. Let me actually zoom in here. And I want to give it depth basically. So I'm going to extrude it. And I'm going to make it about 4, maybe 5. And I'm going to give it a little bit of bevel. Increase the bevel size so it looks a little bit better, like so. And now because this is a different type of shape, we have different controls, right? We have the ability to create a ring inside it. We have the ability to just show a portion of it. Or we can change the number of sides. So it's really easy to create like an octagon using this approach. Or if we want a full circle, we just add as many sides as we want. So let's add like a bright orange color to this. And now let's get started on the legs. For the leg, I'm going to use a cylinder. So let's create a cylinder like so. I'm going to hold down Shift. So it creates a perfect cylinder. And let's reduce the size of this to, let's say, 12 by 12 by 12. And then we'll just make the vertical part bigger. We'll set the top to, let's say, 50. And we'll set the bottom to, let's say, 90. And we'll set the corner to 1. And we'll increase the corner size to 12. Okay. So that's our leg, basically. We can make it a little bit smaller by holding down Shift and resizing it. And I want this one to have this color. So it's FEBBA9, which looks something like this. Now, let's take this and push it down so it sits right on top of my stool. And let's select these objects and align the X to the center and align the Z on the center, like so. So now I want 3 more legs. Let's Control D to duplicate. And let's move this kind of to the outside. And let's actually move this to the outside as well. So we're aligning these with the edge of the stool. And then Control D. And we'll actually rotate them 90 degrees by using this control here. And that created the 4 legs. Now let's switch to a top view, and I want to actually rotate these a little bit. So I'm going to select this one, and I'm going to rotate it like so, about 5 degrees. And you can hold down Shift while doing this, and it's going to snap to increments of 5 degrees. Now let's actually switch to this view. I think it's a little bit better to see. Yeah, so let's do the same here. 5 degrees. Select this. 5 degrees. And 5 degrees. Cool. So now we have the chair all done. Let's select everything. And then we'll do one final rotation to 180 degrees. Okay, and then we can select it. And we can push it down until it reaches that floor. And that's the finished product, a table and chair set. And I actually think that one last change I want to make here is to make this top a little bit thinner. So instead of 8, let's go with like 5. And I think that looks a little bit better. And also the stool, let's change the extrusion to 4 and let's push this down. Yeah, that looks much better. And finally, let's get started on the third exercise for this lesson, which is a 3D snowman. So for the snowman, we're starting with a brand new Spline file where I've set the BG color to this value. And I've also created a plane as a floor, and I've used this color. Now let's create the snowman. So if we think about it, a snowman is basically made up of 2 or 3 spheres. It depends on how you want to make it. And the spheres that are on top are consistently smaller than the ones below. So let's start with that. Let's create a sphere. Let's make one that's about this big. And I'm just going to change its color to E8, F2, F9. So it looks something like that. Now, just to make it a little bit more realistic, I'm gonna shrink that sphere on the vertical axis, like so. And then Control D to duplicate. Let's bring it up. And let's make this one smaller. So let's scale it down. 2 ways we can do that. We can either grab any of these circles here and hold down Shift. And oops, sorry, hold down Shift to scale it, or we can use these controls here. Do whatever works best for you. In my case, I'm just gonna use the circles on this side. Okay, so make that a little bit smaller, and then duplicate this once again, bring it up. Make it smaller, and this is going to be the head of the snowman. Something like that. Okay, cool. So one thing the snowman always has is the 2 eyes, the nose, the mouth, right? We have some buttons that we can add to the lower body. And then we have some arms that we're going to add. So let's actually start with the eyes. So for the eyes, I'm just gonna select this, and let's look at it from, this is the top view. Let's look at it from the front view, okay? So let's start by creating some new spheres, but these will be like much smaller, something like this, maybe 6 by 6. And I'm going to change the color to 2B, 2B, and 2D. So now let's duplicate that. Let's move it a little bit further away. And now here's what I can do. Select both of these, Control G to create a group. So now whenever I select this group, it moves both of the eyes. And I can actually rename the group. Let's call it eyes. So now I can select the eyes, and let's actually rename these spheres as well. Let's do the base, and this is the mid, and this is the top. Okay, so I'll select the top and the eyes, and I'm going to align the x-axis like so. Okay, now let's push these further in, and let's actually disable snapping here. It's going to allow me to make this or use like a free form. So that looks pretty good. All right, now let's move on to the nose, and we usually put like a carrot on a snowman as a nose. So the carrot looks more or less like a cone. But let's go ahead and use a cylinder, and let's make a really big cylinder like so. Let's make it really long. Let's also resize it. And you can use these 3 dots here, these 3 circles, to kind of freely move an object around. Let's shrink this until we get the base to the size that we want, which is about this big, I guess. Maybe a little bit smaller. And because we used a cylinder, we have access to the top and bottom parts, okay? So I'm actually going to change the top here, make it really pointy, something like that. And I'm going to use an orange color for the nose, which is this F284 4D. That looks like so. Okay. Now, it's simply a matter of aligning this nose with the top part. So we're going to align the, let's see, the X. Let's see, top and cylinder. Okay, so select both of these and then align to the X. So that's in the middle. And then I want to align it to the Y-axis. Okay, so vertically, it's exactly in the middle. So now we just take this and we push it closer to the face here, and of course we're gonna bring it up a notch, something like that. And if we want, we can also rotate it a little bit so it's pointing up. That part is really up to you. All right. Now, for the mouth. And the mouth, I just want to make like a smiley kind of shape. So it's a curved shape. For that, we're going to be using the 3D Path tool. This is really simple to use. So you click on plus and you go to Path. And you basically draw a path like you would on any vector-based program, and then that path is transformed to 3D. So I basically am gonna make a point there and a point there, and I'm just gonna make like a smiley face. So you can see the path extrusion here is shaped like a circle, but I can always choose like a rectangle. But what I want is to change the size here, okay? So I'm gonna change it, I'm gonna bring it down all the way down to like 2. And I'm also gonna round off the the caps. So instead of flat, they're rounded. And now I can exit the edit mode for that. Notice how it's a little bit jagged. I can increase the subdivision there to make it smoother. So I'm gonna copy the exact color that I used on the eyes. I'm gonna paste that in, and I'm gonna select this and the top part, and I'm gonna align it to the center X. It seems a little bit crooked, so let's do our best to align it, to rotate it like so. And then just push it a little bit down and a little bit inside, and just rotate it slightly like that. So that's the mouth. And of course we can rename this to mouth or smile or whatever. This is the nose. And then we can take all of these and group them up as the head. So now we can use the control here to hide or show the head. Next up, let's create the buttons that we're going to be placing here in the middle. So for the buttons, I'm actually going to copy one of the eyes. I'm going to paste it here. And I'm going to make it smaller, around 4 on all axes. And let's see, let's bring it outside a little bit. Control D to duplicate. Let's kind of space them out like so. And with all 3 selected, let's group them up. Let's call them buttons. Oops. And we're going to select the middle part, and we're going to align the X and the Y there. So we're going to select this group. We're going to push it in so that the top and bottom buttons are just barely sticking out. And then we're going to select the middle sphere and just bring it outside a little bit as well. Maybe a bit more. Okay, something like that. And you know what? This middle sphere is quite large. So let's actually add another button. So we'll make 4 buttons instead of 3. Yeah, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect. And maybe this one, we push it in just slightly. Okay, cool. So finally, to complete our snowman, we add the hands. And for the hands, I'm going to use the 3D path tool again from here. And I'm going to make like a very simple hand. Okay, let's do one here and maybe one here and maybe one here. Okay, we're going to change the circle size to about 8 or maybe a bit more. Maybe like 16. And with the selected, you can actually move it in different directions. So let's actually bring this over here. And it's kind of facing the wrong way, so we need to rotate it like so. And another rotation like so. All right. So now we can double click. We can select each individual point and move it to where we want it. I want this one to be further back that way. I want this to be a little bit on the top and maybe a little bit shorter, like so. Okay, and maybe make these a little bit smaller, something like 8. Yeah, that looks a bit better. So now let's select this and this, and we'll align these on the z-axis and also on the x-axis in the center. Let's bring this up. Okay. Not bad. And now let's add like some fingers. And, you know, that's also easily done with the 3D path tool. So let's click one there. Let's make like a V. Yeah, so something like that. Let's change the size here to 4. And let's rotate this. And let's double click. Let's make this a little bit better looking. Let's make it more symmetric. Okay. And let's add round caps. And let's actually change the corner value here so it's a little bit more rounded here at the joint. It's like 2. That's better. Okay, now let's just push it inside. Okay, and a little bit this way. All right, so that's a very basic hand. I think we can group this up. We can say arm and maybe just make it just slightly smaller. Yeah, that looks about right. Okay, so now we duplicate this. We move it to the opposite direction. We rotate it to 180 degrees, like so. We bring that in. We make sure the arm sticks out, or the left arm sticks out just as much as the right arm. And that right there is a very basic snowman. Of course, we can get this looking a lot better if we spend more time on the details. But, you know, just as a basic rendition of it, I think this looks just fine. One final thing here, let's organize these layers a little bit better. So I'm going to call this body. So then we have the body, we have the head, we have the base, and save, and we're done. So those are 3 exercises designed to help you understand 3D modeling a lot better, and also working with 3D objects in general. And as you saw, most of the time, complex objects are made up of several simpler ones. And take the table that we created. If we break it down, that table is made up of 5 simple 3D objects, the top and the 4 legs. Each one of these is a simple rectangular shape, but in 3D. Or take the snowman. It might seem complex, but in reality, it's just 3 spheres of different sizes stacked vertically. So whenever you're thinking about how to create a certain complex object in 3D, always start with simpler objects and build it from there. It's gonna be so much easier. Now, time to move on to a very exciting chapter, which is about materials and texturing. In Spline, materials are used to bring your 3D models to life by giving them surface properties like color, shine, or roughness. So whether you want to create something very metallic looking, or maybe you want to create a glass material where you can see through it, or maybe you're looking for, let's say, something very plasticky. You can achieve all that by using materials. Now, Spline comes with its own library of materials. You can always choose between different types of wood, metal, fabric, and a lot more. Although for some of these you do have to pay. However, you can also create your own material by mixing and matching various layers, as you'll see in this lesson. Now, we'll be learning about materials and texturing by creating 3D models, and I have two very special exercises for you in this lesson, so let's get started. The first exercise is a very colorful Rubik's Cube. All right, so I think we all know what a Rubik's Cube is. In case you don't, here's a refresh. It's basically a cube made up of smaller cubes, and those smaller cubes have different colored faces. So let's create that in Spline. We start, of course, with a cube. So we're going to grab the cube tool from the toolbar there, and we're going to click on that surface. By default, Spline will create a cube that's 100 points in size in all directions. Now, the one thing I'm going to do here is just reduce the corner value here to 4. So the edges of the cube are still rounded, but not as round as the default. Okay, so this is our starting point. Now, I want to make like a very special Rubik's Cube. So each smaller cube will get like a glass material. So its core is going to be glass. And the colored sides will be applied later on. So let's go ahead and create that glass material. So we select the object, we go to Material, and by default we have two material layers. We have lighting, and this one we'll talk about later in the course, but short version is the lighting layer allows the object, the material, to receive light, right? So if I hide this, you'll see that the render here changes. It doesn't receive any kind of highlights from the light. It just looks flat. As a general rule, we always keep the lighting layer active. And then the second default material layer is color. And this allows us to change the color of the object, just like we've been doing so far. Now, the thing with materials is that you can create your own material by adding multiple layers. So I can click the plus sign, and that created a new color layer by default, but I can open up the drop-down and choose from a variety of layer types. I can add an image, a video, depth. This is used to create a gradient mostly, noise, Fresnel, rainbow. There's a lot of stuff here that you can add. So for this purpose, because we said we wanted a glass core, we're going to use a glass material layer. Now, it might not seem like much, but we can already see the effects of that glass. And let me actually click and drag the layer under the lighting layer, and the order of the layers here is important. And now I can click this icon and I can change the values of that glass layer. So how much blur do I want? And watch what happens to the shadow, right? That's behind the layer, right? So we're looking at that shadow through the glass layer. So when I change the blur, right? This is like minimal blur, so we can see the shadow very well defined. But if I increase the blur value, the shadow behind the glass cube gets very, very blurry. And you can also change thickness, refraction, various properties to change the way you see through the glass material, basically. In my case, I'm gonna go with a blur that's, let's say, about this much thickness. Just gonna lower that a little bit. Refraction, I'm gonna increase that to about this value. Okay, so that's the glass layer. Now, apart from the glass layer, we also have this color added here, but we can't actually see it. And that's because in Spline, we have something called blend modes for these material layers. So if we click on this icon here, we can choose between normal and multiply, screen, and overlay. Okay, and these blend modes basically tell Spline how to mix the two layers together. So in this case, overlay still uses the glass properties, but it also shows us what's under that layer. It shows us the color. Now, instead of using a solid color, I'm actually going to use a gradient. And for that, we're going to use the depth material layer. And for depth, we're going to go with the following properties. So for blending, we're going to go to smooth, and we're going to set our gradient the following way. The first color, EBA 9FD, and the second color, 370C44. The type, we can either choose linear or radial. Position local, origin 0. We're going to keep these, exactly the same. Now, what we can do is with the gradient selected, we can actually start moving it around. So I can decide how far or how close to the origin that a gradient is. Okay, and I'm just gonna set it to about this much. So this is what it looks like when we rotate the camera. Now, one thing I want to do is decrease the intensity of this gradient. I'm going to set it to 60, and that's our glass material. Now, if we want to reuse this material in the future, we can select it, and we click next to material here, and we click the plus sign, and we can rename this to glass material, or glass, or whatever you want to call it. So now, if I create, let's say, a sphere, I can go back to the material here, click the dots, and instead of remaking that material over and over, I can just click glass material. That makes it reusable. And the best part is, now if I click outside or I deselect any object on my canvas here, and I go to material assets, I can click the dots here, and I can click edit, and then I can modify this in any way I want. So if I don't want to show the glass material and just make it solid, I can do that. And that will affect all the objects that are using this material. That right there is our core glass material and our core cube. Now let's go ahead and add the colored sides. I'm going to start by just doing a top-down view, and I'm going to create a rectangle right here. And this by default is 100 by 100, but I'm going to make it 90 by 90. And I'm doing that because, and let me just enable snapping here. I want to take this and put it right in the middle of my cube face. And I want a little bit of offset from the edges here. So now let's add some rounded corners, maybe about 4 units. And no bevel, but let's do a bit of extrusion. Let's say about 2 units. So now we have this this plate basically that acts as a cube face. So let's give it some color. Let's select it. And for the color, I'm going to use this value here. It's a red. And I'm going to create a material. And just in case I want to reuse this, I can create a color asset, right? So I click on the color, and where it says color assets, I just click on plus, and I can rename it to, let's say, Rubik Red. And I can even create a material. So for the material, I want to do like a relatively shiny plastic surface, because right now this is kind of flat looking, right? So under material, I'm going to add a new layer, and I'm going to choose a matte cap. And for matte cap, let's go with maybe this one. These are basically images from the Spline library. You can also upload your own image right here, but I'm looking for like a shiny, but not very shiny looking image. So I think this one will do just fine. But I also want the color to come through. So I'm going to change the blending mode for the matte cap to overlay. All right, so that looks a little bit better. And you can see if we twist it around the way the light hits it. I'm not sure if it's visible on the recording, but for me, it looks a little bit better. Okay, so with this material created, let's add it to our library, and we're gonna call it a red material. Now, let's actually create some color assets for the other colors that we want to use. So I want to use an orange. Let's create a new asset. We're gonna call it Rubik Orange, and the RGB value is this. Then create a new one. Let's call it Rubik Green, and the value is this. Next is going to be Rubik Blue with those values. And finally, we're going to create a Rubik Pink that uses that color code. So now let's also create the corresponding materials. So for that, I'm going to duplicate the red material, and I'm going to keep exactly the same properties. Instead, I'm only going to change the color, right? So let's do the orange, and let's rename this to orange material. We'll do the same, duplicate. Let's call it green material, and we're going to use Rubik Green. Duplicate once more. Let's do the blue material, use Rubik Blue. And the last one, pink material, and we're going to use Rubik Pink. Awesome. Now, let's create the other faces for our small cube. So we're going to take this, Control D to duplicate, and let's just push it down. And because we have snapping activated, all we got to do is just slightly nudge it up, and it's going to automatically snap to the bottom of that cube. And now let's change the material to, let's say, the pink. Okay, now let's do this side. So duplicate this. Let's bring it over here. Let's rotate it to 90 degrees. Let's push that down. Let's push it to the surface there. And now let's just align it in the middle like so. And let's use the green material or the orange. Let's do the green. Okay, let's do the other side, the opposite side. And for the material, we're going to use the blue. See how the glass shows the different faces? Very interesting. Okay, final two faces. Duplicate this, bring it over, rotate while holding down Shift. Yeah, and let's snap it in place, and let's snap it in place like so. Okay, that's good. What materials haven't we used? Orange. Let's do orange here. And finally, let's do, how many do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we have only 5 materials. So we're going to have to duplicate one of them. So let's do maybe the blue, the pink, the green. Let's do the pink. So that's pretty good. That's our cube, our small cube. Now we need to duplicate this a couple of times, right? In fact, 26 times, because a Rubik's Cube by default has 27 smaller cubes. But just so we don't recreate this over and over, let's reuse it by making it into a component. So I'm going to select everything, and I can right-click and choose Create Component. And I'm going to call this Small Cube. So now what we can do is just set this aside, and I can duplicate it, and that's going to create an instance. Basically, this is the master component, this is the instance. I can have as many instances as I want. Those are basically copies, but any change I make to the master component, for instance, hiding one or more faces, will also be applied to every single instance. So with the instance selected, let's go ahead and duplicate it. So I'm going to hit Control D, and I'm just going to bring this out like so. And I'm also going to rotate it to 90 degrees. Okay, so we show different faces of the small cube. Control D again to create another one. And again, I'm going to rotate it. It doesn't have to be on the same axis. I can rotate it like this, for instance. And I can even rotate it like this. Cool. Now select these 3, Control D again. And let's move them like so. Let's just make sure there is no gap there that shouldn't be. So we're all good. So then I can take each one of these and do a bit of rotation, 90 degrees this way, maybe 90 degrees this way, and this one 90 degrees maybe that way. There we go. So now select these 3, Control D again. Let's bring these out. And let's do a final round of rotation. Maybe like this, and maybe like this. And this one maybe like so. Okay. So that's one row of my Rubik's Cube. Now let's select this. Control G to create a group. Let's call it row 1. So then let's duplicate it. Yeah, let's bring it up. And then we can do a nice rotation at like 180 degrees. Let's bring this back down and let's align it like so. And let's just do a 45-degree rotation like that. And then duplicate it again, Control D. And let's bring up the other one. And let's do another final rotation here, 180 degrees. Let's bring that back up. And let's rotate it this way, another 45 degrees. So now let's select all 3 layers and we'll do some alignment. We'll align to the center of the x-axis and then to the center of the z-axis. Cool. So that's our Rubik's Cube. Let's actually push this like further out. Select all 3. And I just realized that I made a slight mistake here. When I selected the cubes, I also selected the directional light and included that in pretty much all the copies but we just want one directional light. So let me delete the rest and let me grab this one and then just place it somewhere outside of the main group. Okay. So now take these 3 rows, Control G, call it Rubik's Cube, and just let's reset its position. So it sits right in the middle. Let's bring it up so it sits on that floor. And there we go. That's one completed rendition of the Rubik's Cube. And see how the core of the cubes is changing depending on how I look at it. That's because of the glass material. I think that's super, super cool. All right, for this next exercise, we'll create a robot toy head that uses both metallic and plastic materials. I start with a new Spline document where I've added a background color and a plane as to act as a floor. Now, our robot head will have a relatively complicated structure, and we'll be able to achieve that structure by using something called Boolean operations. And I'll show you what those are in just a little bit. For now, let's start by drawing a rectangle like this, and we're gonna make it 50 by 70. And we're also gonna add maybe an 8-pixel corner. And I'm gonna bring it up and I'm gonna rotate it this way 90 degrees. Yeah, so I can, look at it from the front. Now I want to extrude this, so I'm gonna use, let's say 70 as the extrusion. And let me just, for now, let me give it a slightly lighter color so it's a bit easier to see what we're doing. Now I want to punch a hole through this object. So I'm going to grab the rectangle tool again, and by selecting the face that I want to draw the rectangle to, yeah, I'm just going to do this. And this was initially 50 by 70. Let's subtract like, let's say 10 points. So we'll make it 40 by 60. And let's turn on snapping to object, and let's align this to the middle of the object that I've already created. And, sometimes snapping doesn't really work properly. So in this case, just select both objects and do the alignment manually. In this case, I'm just going to align the X axis, and you saw how Spline kind of gave me a preview of how these objects will be aligned by showing me that red rectangle right through the middle. And by the way, the alignment works on either sides as well. So I don't have to align it to the center. I can align min, which in this case is left, or max, which in this case is the right side. So let's set a corner of about 6 on this second rectangle. So that looks pretty good. And now I want to extrude this. So we used an extrusion of 70 previously. Let's do 80 this time. And now I want to push this back until I get roughly the same reveal on both sides. Now, to cut a hole in this bigger object using the smaller object, I need to select both of them. And in the right side, where we see Boolean modifier, we have 3 Boolean operations. We can either do subtraction, which is the first one. We can do intersect, which is the second one, or we can do union. So here's what each of these is doing. The first one, subtraction, will basically subtract the smaller object from the bigger one. But it does take in account the order of layers. So it subtracted the layer that's on top from the layer that's on the bottom. Now, at any point, I can select the group that was created and I can change the operation. So if I do an intersection, that's going to have a different result. And if I do union, that's going to merge the two objects together. But what I want is subtraction. Okay? And that basically created this object, which has a hole inside it. And what's nice is that this Boolean operation is non-destructive, which means I still have access to the original two objects. Right? So I can, for instance, duplicate rectangle 2, and I can move it outside of my object. The Boolean result is still there, but now I have an extra object, I can play around with. So with this object selected, let's actually reduce the extrusion to about 74, and let's select the 2, and let's do an alignment to the center of the z-axis, like this. And this basically gives me part of that smaller object just sticking out, both from the front and from the back. And now with it selected, I want to also kind of round off the edges here a little bit. So I'm going to add a bevel. Let's say about 2 or maybe 1. 1 is enough. And just for added detail, I'm going to increase the bevel size to 4. Right, so now that's nicely rounded. Let's take a closer look. And I think this is just a bit too long. Okay, for a robot head, it's a little bit too deep, I should say. So let's do something else. Let's get the original rectangle and change the extrusion from 70 to 50. Yeah, so that's much better. The rectangle here can stay the exact same size because it's used for a Boolean operation, so it doesn't really matter how deep it is. But this one, we also need to subtract 20 points from this, so let's do that. Okay, so that's great. Now we're getting somewhere. Now what I want to do is add sort of a cap here, kind of a plate if you want. And I want this plate to sit on this lip here and also come up a bit from the top edge of my robot. First of all, I'm gonna grab the rectangle tool and I'm gonna draw a rectangle there. I'm gonna make it the same size as my original rectangle, which is 70 by 50. But now I'm just slightly gonna increase that size to, let's say, 75 by 55. And I'm also gonna extrude it. Let's do like 4 for the extrusion, or maybe a bit less, like 2. Okay. Now we'll take all 3 and we'll align the X and the Y. And now we'll add some corners, some border radius to this. And let's see, we used 8 in the original, so we're going to use 8 here as well. And I'm also going to bevel to make it nice and rounded. And I'm actually going to extrude it a bit more, like 4 pixels. I want to basically cut a hole in this plate that's the same size as my smaller rectangle here. So I can duplicate this and I can bring it forward like so. And I can now select the plate and this new object and do a subtract once again. But we actually used the wrong order here. So the object that we want to subtract from should be under, like so. So now we select both, we do subtract. And now we get this other Boolean shape that looks like this. So now what I can do is push it back until it closes that gap. And just to make it a little bit easier for us, let's actually push this inner side back. And I'll select the plate and push it forward like so. And I'm actually going to turn off snapping because this is one of those cases where it doesn't snap exactly where we want it to snap. So I'm just going to manually position this like so. And now you can see that it's a little bit too far in. So I'm slightly going to bring it out like that. Okay, cool. So we take this and we duplicate it. And now we position it on this side, just to make sure we close that gap like that. Okay, so that's the front plate, that's the back plate. Now let's bring this back. And, you know, here we can play around with how we want these to look. So do we want the, let's call it core object to be kind of inset inside the plate like so? Or do we want it protruding out a little bit like so? So this is actually a better angle. Do we want it like this, or do we want it like this? Personally, I think I'll go with the inset. And I'm also gonna increase its size slightly, just so it's inset on this side as well. Not sure how well you can see that on the video. And let's make it just a little bit smaller like so. Okay, so we've done some good work here using the Boolean operations. So now let's go ahead and rename some of these layers to be more organized. So this we'll call front plate. This we'll call back plate. This one is actually the core, let's call it. And this one is the shell. Cool. Now, we've constructed the head, the core of the head, basically. Let's add the rest of the elements that will make up our robot. So let's start with the eyes. And for the eyes, I'm just going to draw a circle right there. And I'm going to make it, I think, 12 by 12. Yeah, let's give it a nice bright color, just so we can see what we're doing here. Okay, so I want to extrude this. Let's extrude it to about 4. Maybe a bit less, 3. And I want to bevel those sides just to, yeah, make it a bit sleeker. And I think I'm going to increase the extrusion here again to 4. And I want to create like a cutout inside of it, right? I can do that with the Boolean operations again, but because I used an extruded circle, I have access to the ring property. So that allows me to make like a donut right here, which is pretty cool, right? So that's like an outer shell, I guess you could call it, for the robot eyes. Now let's actually make this a different color. Let's make it like that. And now let's create another ellipse, just smaller this time. Let's say 8 by 8. Let's give it a nice color. And let's do the exact same extrusion that we did here, which is 4. And we'll also bevel it exactly the same way. And let's see. I want to basically align these two. So let's align them on the X and the Y. And let's bring back, or actually, no. Let's select both and let's align them to the Z, to the very back, like so. All right. So now I just need to make the yellow part a little bit bigger. So let's say 9 by 9. So it's a very snug fit. So now let's take both. Let's do the alignment once again. So that's almost a complete eye. We just need something in the middle of it, right? So let's grab a sphere and we'll just drag one right here. Let's make it smaller. And let's bring it that way and that way. A little bit bigger, I think. And let's select the sphere and the yellow part. Align them to the center like so. Okay. So now take the sphere, bring it in. Not bad, except I want to create like a socket for the sphere to sit in, if that makes any sense. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the sphere, do one more alignment with both of these elements just to make sure it's exactly in the middle. And I'm going to call it eyeball. And I'm going to call this yellow part eye socket, and I'm going to call this part eye cap, let's say. Okay, so I'm going to take the eyeball, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to hide the original. And this duplicate, I'm going to make it slightly bigger. And I can do that by going in here on the scale, locking all the values together, and just going to say 0.5. And maybe a bit more, 0.52. And that just scales it on all three axes from the middle. So now I'm going to take the eye socket and the copy of the eyeball, and I'm going to do a subtract. Okay? And that basically created an object, I'm not sure how well you can see it here, with, let's say, a small crater in the middle of it. So now I can bring my eyeball on top, and I can show it. And that eyeball sits nicely within that socket, but it has like a little space around it. It has a hole that it sits in. So now I can, take that boolean, give it the color, and with that, our eye is complete. So now I can take the eyeball, I can take the boolean here and the eye cap, group it together, and call it eye. And I can also create a component out of it, because of course we need two eyes. So let's duplicate. Let's push this to the side like so. Let's group this together and let's align them to the middle of this element like so. And now let's select them and let's push them so they're right up against my robot face here. And if at some point these helper lines that you see here, the red, green, and blue are getting in your way or just annoying you, you can actually go to global settings. You just click outside of the canvas, go to global settings and turn helpers off like so. Now we made the eyes. And it's time to make the mouth. And the mouth, because it's a robot, it doesn't really speak, right? It has a speaker that makes sounds, but the mouth itself is just there to kind of humanize this face. So we're going to do something very simple. I'm going to create a cube on this side here. And let's give it a color. Doesn't matter what color. And I'm just gonna reduce the corner size there. And I'm gonna make it much smaller, maybe a bit smaller. And let's select both of these, align them on the X like that. And now it's simply a matter of moving this into position. And I think I'll push it down a little bit. Don't worry about the colors. We'll be changing these and adding new materials. For now, I just want to create all the elements and then we'll get to coloring. And yeah, now that I look at it, I think I'm gonna make the eyes just a little bit bigger. So something like that. And let's bring this in a little bit closer. Let's align these back in the center. Let's push them down a little bit. Yeah, so I think that looks much, much better. Okay, next up, let's do the ears. So we have ears on both sides. For that, I'm gonna grab this eye cap, paste it in, and I'm just gonna drag it outside of that component. Just put it to the side. Let's rotate it like so, 90 degrees. And I don't actually want the ring inside. I just want the overall shape of it. Okay, so now let's grab this and align it to the middle there. And I'm just gonna push it let's turn on snapping. Yeah, so I just pushed it right up to the surface of that that shell right there. And I'm actually going to duplicate this. And I'm going to make it just a little bit smaller, maybe 3 for the extrusion. And I'm going to use a slightly different material there. Okay, so this, let's group it up. Let's call it ear, and let's right click and let's create a component. So now we'll duplicate that component. We'll push it to the other side and we'll rotate it 180 degrees. And now we just push it to that side, like so. And let's see, I think the extrusion, or the extrusion here could be just a little bit smaller. So maybe just 2 right there, because I don't want this ear to stick out too much. So let's just bring that back. And because that was a component, the other side was updated as well. Great. Finally, let's create an antenna. So for the antenna, let's grab again one of these eye caps. Yeah, and let's bring it up. Let's rotate it this way, 90 degrees. Okay, and let's put it right on the top there. Let's actually make it a little bit smaller, like so. So let's align it with the shell exactly in the middle. And let's push it down. Super. So that's the base of the antenna. Let's create a cylinder. Okay, and let's just round off the corners here to the bare minimum. And let's make this much smaller. And let's also align it along the X and along the Z. Okay, and I think that could be a bit bigger. And also a little bit longer, like so. So now let's take these. Let's do another round of alignment. That's cool. And finally, at the very top, let's add a sphere. Let's make that sphere, oops, just a little bit smaller. And same thing, we'll grab the sphere, the cylinder, and the base when we'll align the X and the Z to the center. And we actually need to do another alignment with the shell. Okay, so now we take the sphere and we bring it up. Let's turn off snapping. And we can just position this kind of anywhere we want. Okay, so that is the antenna. So now let's select these three, group them up, and call it antenna. Awesome. So now we have the full structure of our robot head complete. It's time to add materials. And I want to make this into a very shiny, very reflective, very metallic looking robot head. So let's start by creating a metallic material. And I'm gonna start by selecting this front plate. And by going to material, I wanna make it look like something chrome, right? So first things first, I'm gonna change the color to 999 DAD. And then I'm gonna add a matte cap layer. Matte cap, by the way, stands for material capture. And we're gonna select this here, and I'm gonna set the blend mode to overlay. And already we can see this is starting to get really metallic looking, right? It's very shiny, very reflective. You can, see the highlights here around the edges. Really cool. But we can actually go one step further. And that's by adding another material layer. And we're going to put it under the lighting. And we're going to select a rainbow. In a rainbow, already you can see just how it completely transformed that material. So for the properties, we're going to actually lower the frequency here to about 7 or 8, and the rest will leave exactly the same. But I'm also going to change the blending mode from normal to overlay, so it factors in all the colors and layers under it. And just by doing that, look at how metallic looking, chrome looking, and reflective that material is. That's very nice. So let's save this material. We're going to call it metal, and we're going to apply it to the core. We're going to apply it to the back plate and also to the shell. Now that's pretty cool. Also, I want to apply it on the ear, on the first eye cap. Like that. And I want to apply it to the original eye cap around the eyes, the one that's around the eyes, like so. Nice. Now, let's create another version of this metal, but one that's a little bit darker. I'm going to right-click on metal under Material Assets, and I'm going to click Duplicate, and I'm going to call it Metal Dark. Now, the only property that I'm going to change here is the color. We're going to go with 595 D6C. the rest is exactly the same. So now I'm going to apply this darker metal to the antenna, the cylinder, and the base. So that's going to be metal dark. And I'm also going to apply it here to the mouth. Metal dark. Just for added contrast. Now, we need to create two more materials. One is going to be for the eyeballs. And I'm thinking something also metallic, but with a different color. So let's duplicate metal dark. Oops. We'll call it metal blue. Same properties, except the color is going to be 29339F. So now I'm going to select the eyeball, and I'm going to add the metal blue material. And finally, let's add a plastic material to the second part of the ear here, and also the sphere on top of the antenna. So let's actually go with the sphere. Under material, we're going to change the color to E87426, and we're going to add some shininess to it by using a matte cap. That matte cap, let's go with something that's not too shiny, but still will look pretty good. Let's go with this one, for instance. And I'm going to change the blend mode to overlay so it borrows that color that we used. Cool. So now let's save this material to plastic. So now let's apply that to the ear. And say hello to our new friend here, the robot. I don't have a name for it just yet, but if you think of something, leave a comment down below. Now, this robot model perfectly demonstrates how materials can completely transform a 3D model. The same lighting can make materials like shiny metal look sleek and reflective, while making matte plastic look more subdued, softer, less reflective, and give it, like I said, a more subdued appearance. And the best part is creating your own materials in Spline is super simple. It's just a matter of experimenting with different material layers and how they should interact with one another. Now, speaking of lighting, that's a very important aspect to master when it comes to 3D design. So, coming up next, let's talk about lighting and environment. Now, the way a 3D model looks like is heavily influenced by the lighting conditions, and all the exercises we've done so far were using the default lighting that was provided by Spline. However, there are several light types you can use in Spline, and each one of these has different properties you can adjust to dial things in. So let's explore this topic in more detail by changing the lighting setup for a rocket. And this is the rocket in question. We'll be getting this from Envato, which, in case you didn't know, has a 3D category. And you'll find lots of different models and templates and renders in here. And recently, Envato added the Spline category, so we can actually do a search here, and we can filter, by Spline, and we'll find our rocket. And from here, you can also do a live preview directly in your browser. And if we go back, we can go ahead and download this the Spline file. So I've already done that, and I switched back to Spline, where I'm going to click the import button on the top right, and I'm going to select Spline. and I'm going to choose the file that I just downloaded. So now we can work with this just like any other Spline file. And this is also an animated file, so if we want to preview the animation, we can just click play or shift space, and we're gonna see this nice animation that we get here on the various elements. Now, let's go back to the topic of this lesson, which is lighting. All right, so in Spline, we have three types of lights. We have directional, point, and spot. On top of that, there is also an ambient light that sets the default lighting for any object. And the settings for that ambient light can be found on the right sidebar when you don't have anything selected. You just go to light, and then you can turn it on or off. You can change the color, the intensity, and the quality of the shadows. So if you want to render high quality shadows, the render will be a bit slower. If you want to render low quality shadows, that's going to be faster. But just as a before and after example, here's how this scene looks like when I turn the ambient light off. Right? Massive, massive difference. And with the ambient light on and off and on, you get the picture. Now, personally, I don't really think about the ambient light. I just leave it on all of the time and focus on the other types of light. And speaking of the other types of light, by default, any new Spline scene comes with a directional light. It's the one that you see here, and you'll see its representation in any Spline scene with this graphic here. And any directional light, as with any light in Spline, can be selected and it can be moved, it can be rotated, and moving it really gives you an idea of what that light is all about. So a directional light is ideal for simulating the light coming from the sun, or the light that's present in most open spaces. So right here, we have a directional light that's off to the side and above my rocket, right? So if I turn it off from the layers panel, this is the effect that it has. You notice how suddenly the rocket became more flat because it doesn't have that light to give it the highlights and the shadows. But if I turn it back on, right, the part of the rocket that's illuminated by my directional light suddenly looks a lot different. And as I said, I can take this light and I can move it up or down or left and right or back and forwards. And that's the kind of effect that it has. And creating a directional light is simple. You just click on the plus sign and you go all the way to the bottom and you'll find the three types of light. The next type of light is point. And the purpose of a point light is to emit a light beam from a specific point in space. And these will also fade away with the distance. Now, these lights are great for representing, for instance, a car light or a house lamp or a traffic light. And creating one is super simple. You just go here, you choose point light. And that placed my point light right in the middle of my scene, right? And I can, move it again, the same way that I can do with any other light. And you can see the kind of effect that it has. This is a much stronger light. And if we look in the sidebar, we have the various properties for it. We can change the color. So for instance, if I want to shine a blue light, right, I can do that, and that's gonna have a massive impact on my scene here. But I can also change the intensity. I can change the distance. So how far do I want that light to travel? And also I can change something called decay. And from what I understand, the decay lets you specify how powerful the light should be when it's further away from you as opposed to when it's closer to you. So if I set a big decay, the light will still shine relatively the same color intensity on the rocket, but it's going to be less intense on the backdrop here, if that makes any sense. Of course, you can decide whether or not to allow shadows, or if you want that light to cast shadows. Resolution, radius, again, just some more properties for you to play around with. So that's the point light. So let's go ahead and delete that. And let's move on to the third light type, which is the spotlight. So a spotlight is basically a cone-shaped light that's great for simulating artificial lighting from objects, like, for instance, a lamp or a street light. So if we bring this all the way up, you can see that the kind of shape that it casts, it's a cone light, basically. So, you can move it around, you can rotate it, maybe in that direction. And again, just like with the other lights, you can specify a light color, the intensity, the distance, the angle of the light. You can choose to blur the edges of the light. So, we can, reduce the intensity of the light here. And, we can maybe move it upwards a little bit. And we can change the color of the light. Let's say we want maybe like a greenish or yellow, or maybe a pink light. Yeah, so that just adds a little bit of color. We just have some highlights here, and it also casts a little bit of that color on the floor there. So these are very specialized lights. The point light, the spotlight. Mainly, you'll be using the directional light because, in my opinion, this adds has the biggest effect on the scene. And one thing you'll notice on some of these lights, you have two properties here called blur and penumbra. Now these are used to achieve more realistic shadows. Okay, so the blur property controls the general blurriness of the shadow. So just take a look at the shadow of the rocket behind here. So it currently has a blur of 1, but I can increase that, and you'll notice the shadows that are cast by this light are getting more and more blurred. And then you also have another property called penumbra, which controls the blurriness across the distance of a shadow. Okay, so this changes the following way. When you have penumbra set to 0, you barely have any kind of blurriness to the shadow. But when you start playing around with it, the way I understand it is that the part of the shadow that's closer to the subject that's casting the shadow will actually be less blurred than the part of the shadow that's further away from it. So, just play around with these settings and find whatever works best for you. But those are the 3 types of light that you can use in Spline. Now, before we wrap up this lesson, I also want to talk about the lighting material layer. You might remember from some of the other exercises, whenever we were creating a material, we had a layer, usually the first one, that was called lighting. Now, the purpose of this layer is to allow that material to interact with the light. So for instance, let's select this cone the cone of the rocket, or the rocket cap, as it's called here. So the material here used is spaceship red. All right, so if we open up the properties, we can see it has a lighting layer. Now, if we turn that off, this is suddenly a lot flatter because that material no longer receives any kind of lighting or shadows from the lights around it. But if we turn it back on, now this part of the material is lit up by the directional light. So let's do that once more. Let's hide the light. So now you'll see that if I move this light up and down or even closer to the subject, that material doesn't change. It's not affected in any way by the change in the lighting setup. But again, if I go back and I turn that light back on, now that material will react to the changes in the lighting setup. And on top of that, there are 4 different types of lighting you can choose from this layer. You have Lambert, Phong, Physical, and Tune. Now, Lambert is basically a matte type without too much shine added to it. And that's perfect for, concrete or sand-like surfaces. And then you have Phong, which, let me actually zoom in here so you can see the difference, hopefully. So if we switch to Phong, now that looks a little bit different because this adds something called specular reflection. And this is best used for materials like plastic or skin that are just a little bit more, let's call it shiny. And then you have Physical. And Physical is very similar to Phong, except this is a lot more reflective and you have a lot more controls here because this is much better suited for stuff like metal or ceramic even. And then you have Tune, which has just a cartoonish effect, which looks something like this. So if you want something to be like very reflective, you would choose Physical. If you want something a little bit more matte looking, you would go with either Phong or Lambert. So, as you can see, there's plenty to discover when it comes to lighting in Spline, and please pay attention to it whenever you're creating 3D models, because even the most beautiful 3D object will look bad if the lighting setup is not right. Now, how about we take some of the 3D models we've built so far in this course and bring them to life by creating some animations and interactions. I've prepared 3 very interesting exercises for this lesson, and the best part is you can follow along by downloading the assets that I'll be using. You can find links to those in the video description. Now, let's get the ball rolling by animating a 3D loader icon. So I'm gonna open the file called starter 3D loader, where we can see just a series of rings, basically. I would like to create some animations and animate each individual ring. In Spline, we can do that by using something called state-based animations. So, in the layers panel, we have a group called loader, and then each ring has its own layer. Let's start with ring 1, which is the smallest one in the center. Now, if we go in the sidebar where it says states, we can click on the plus sign, and that will create a base state and state 2. And by the way, we can double click this and we can rename it to something else, to whatever we want. Now, with state, let's call it state 2. So with state 2 selected, we can make changes to this. In my case, I would like to rotate it to, let's say, 175 degrees or even 180 degrees. But let's do 175 so we can see a difference. So now I can easily switch between states by clicking here. That's where we started, and this is where we are now. So now, how do we animate this change? We go to events, we click on the plus sign, and we select start, and then we select transition. And then we open up the transition dialog. We make sure the target is ring 1, and then we define the steps of the transition. So we go from the current state, or the base state, let's select that, and we go to state 2. And the one here represents the animation duration. Ease in out is the easing. So now we can do shift space to play that animation, but it only plays once and it's a little bit too fast. So let's select ring 1 yet again and change some of these parameters. Let's click here and we'll change the duration to, let's say, 4 seconds. I'm going to keep the same easing, even though there are plenty to choose from, and you also have a custom option where you define your own easing curve. Delay, I'm going to leave it at 0, and loop, I'm going to set it to infinite. So that will make this animation. But it's kind of glitchy at that point, see? Because I set its rotation to 175 degrees. So once it gets to the end of the animation, it basically resets. So in order to make this seamless, we can do two things. Either state 2 will have that extra 5 degrees. So now we have the full rotation of 180. Or if we want to take it back 5 degrees, we can actually set up a cycle here. We can do ping pong or ping pong reverse. So ping pong actually looks like this. And ping pong reverse is the other way around. But it kind of all looks the same here because of how we set up the rotation. But the idea is when you do ping pong, it goes one transition in normal direction, and then it goes one in reverse. So one back, one forward kind of thing. And if we want to change the easing, let's do like a spring so you can see the difference. Yeah, it's just a different timing function which defines the progress of the animation over the animation duration. If you've worked with animations in CSS or some other disciplines, then you probably know what I'm talking about. But in my case, I'm gonna leave this at ease in and out, since I think it looks the best for this type of loader. Now, let's add animations to the other rings. So I'm going to select ring 2. I'm going to create a new state for it. Let's call it state 2. And just like I did with the other one, let's rotate it. This time, let's do only like 150 degrees. And then select ring 3, create a state for this one as well. State 2. And this one, let's rotate it the other way around. Let's do like 170 degrees. Or actually, let's do the full 180. So that's the base state, and that's state 2. So now we can go to ring 2 and we can create the same event or something different, but I'm going to create the exact same one. So we're going to transition ring 2. We go from the base state to state 2, 4 seconds, ease in and out, infinite loop, ping pong reverse. So now play. And now these animate together. Of course, you can achieve different effects here. You can add, for instance, a delay. Let's do like 1 second delay and maybe decrease the duration of the animation to 3 seconds. And that looks something like this. So they animate at different rates. And you can do the same for ring number 3. However, if it's like an event that keeps happening, you can actually copy it and you can select the new elements and you can paste it. All right, so that pasted the event that we had there, that we had on ring 2. However, make sure you change the target here to ring 3. And the rest of the properties were copied as well. So we go from the base state to state 2, over 3 seconds, ease in and out, infinite ping pong reverse. So now, if we play, this is what our animation looks like. Pretty cool. In my case, though, I would actually prefer these animations to have no delay whatsoever and just have the same duration all around. Yeah, so 4 seconds here, 0. So they all start animating at the exact same time. Just like that. And this can be used as a 3D loader in a web page, for example, because you can export it. And there are a number of ways to include a 3D object like this in a web page. I'm not going to cover it in this course because it's beyond the scope of it, but just so you know, that is definitely a possibility. Okay, now it's time to create an interactive model, and we'll make our robot head follow the mouse cursor. So I opened the file called starter robot, which if you can remember, we created this previously in the course. So as a cool interaction, let's make it follow our mouse cursor. So I'm going to select the entire group, the one that's called a robot head. And under events, I'm going to click on the plus sign. And for the trigger, I'm going to select look at. So we want the object that we selected to look at the cursor. That's our target. Plane, we're going to set this aligned with camera. And the rest, let's leave at default for now. So let's play it. So once I get into view and I move my mouse cursor around, so does the robot. And if I hover outside of the view, it just resets. So that's pretty cool. But let's make this interaction a bit more natural. I'm going to change the plane distance here to 200. So let's see what effect that had. Suddenly, the robot moves a lot more than previously. So that's good. And I'm also going to change the speed from 5 to, let's say, about 20. So now, it moves a lot faster. And if you can actually see my mouse cursor, which is right here, yeah, as soon as I move the cursor, so does the robot, okay? But if I don't want that, I can add something called damping, which is like a lag. So if I just change this to 5 and I preview, here's my mouse cursor, and you'll notice that the robot is not as responsive as before. Of course, I can increase this to a very dramatic amount, let's say like 50. And now the robot will actually respond with a big lag. So Here's my cursor. I move it here, and the robot barely follows it. But in my case, I don't want the follow or the look at interaction to happen like instantly. So just a little bit of damping, like 5 or 10, will usually do the trick just fine. So our interaction now looks like this. And of course, whenever you're dealing with a character like this, you can animate not only the entire character, but also parts of it. So if my eyes had a light part, a white part in them, I could animate that individually and make it even more realistic. But have a play with this and fine tune it and work with your own 3D models to see what kind of results you're getting. Now, if you remember, the very first exercise in this course was modeling a 3D keycap. So, coming full circle, let's take that keycap and turn it into a mini interactive 3D keyboard. So, I opened the file called Starter Interactive 3D Keyboard, and you will recognize the keycap we created in the very first lesson. The only difference is I added some material to this. So very simply, I added a depth material layer with some color. I basically added a gradient. And I've also constructed this kind of shiny metallic base for the keyboard. So let's build it from here. And just as a reminder, you can also download this starter asset by following the links in the video description. So any key cap has a letter or a number or a symbol on it, right? So let's go ahead and do the same. We'll grab the text tool and we'll just place a text object right there on that plane. And let's start with the letter E. I can reduce the size of this text box, basically. And let me just zoom in so you can see what we're doing just a little bit better. Okay, and as for the properties, you can change those from the sidebar. So for font size, let's go with something bigger, like 22 pixels. Line height, spacing, the font, let's just stick with Roboto, but we'll increase the font weight just a little bit. And, if we want, we can also extrude this piece of text. Although in my case, I'm just going to leave it just like that. And finally, I'm going to change the color of the text to FEB0, B7, something like that. So now I'm going to take the text and I'm going to take the cube, Control G to group them up. We'll call them key E. Okay. So now let's create the rest of the keys because I want to spell the word Envato in here. So one way to do it would be to Control D or Command D to duplicate this group and then just drag it around. However, Spline has a very nifty feature called Cloner. So when you select an object, you can go to the sidebar and activate Cloner. And that's going to create multiple copies of that object. And you can define just how many copies you want. And you can define how you want to display those. So I want 2 rows of 3 keys, so I'm going to select a grid. So on the x-axis, I want 3 keys. On the y-axis, which is vertical, I want 1. And on the z, I want 2. Okay, so now I can take this and I can move it like in the middle of my support here. And, I can go with a top view and I can slightly change the gap between these instances in all directions. And I'm just going to eyeball this for now. So now it's simply a matter of changing the text on each individual key. However, in the layers panel, I just have the one key. And if I change the text here to, let's say, X, that's going to change it on all of them. So what we need to do is select the cloned key, and here in the inspector, click Convert to Instances. So that's going to create a separate group here called Key Clones, where we have the 6 clones. So this basically created a component and then 6 instances of that component. And this component right here, I can hide it. I can, move it outside of my my actual keyboard, because I have all the components I need, which is a very handy feature. Instead of doing that by hand, you can do it with the cloner tool. So let's go ahead and hide that main component, and let's go and change the text on these keys. So now I have the word spelled out for me. Now, let's create the interaction. So I want this key to move up and down when I hit the letter that's on the key. So when I hit E, I want to simulate a key press. For that, let's create the animation first. So select the first clone, create a new state. In that state, I'm just going to change the Y position to, let's say, 50 or -50 to take it down. But that's a bit too much. So let's go with -32, let's say. Okay, so that's the normal state, and that's the pressed state. And we can do the same for the others. So create a new state and set the Y to -32. And let's make sure we revert these back to the base state when we're finished. Same here, -32. Let's go back to the base state. So with the states created for each key, it's time to add the events. So we basically want to listen for key presses, and when that key is pressed, we start the animation. Now, one thing you'll notice when working with the cloner tool or with components in general is that you cannot add events to component instances. So you can go to the main component and you can add events here, but those events will then be applied to every single instance, which in our case doesn't really work because each instance must have its own event. It needs to respond to a different key press. So the solution is just to detach all of the instances from the main component and just let them exist as separate entities. Before we do that, let's actually show the main component, because there's a weird bug that I've seen. If the main component is hidden and you detach an instance, Spline will set that as hidden, and you have to manually show it again. I don't know why it's doing that, but it's no biggie. So let's detach all of these from the main component. I'm going to keep this key just in case. I'm just going to hide it for now. So then I can now select each key and I can add the events. Now, here's the problem. As soon as I detached that instance, my states were gone. So I'm going to have to remake those states for each of these keys. But it's the same as before. You just click create a new state, and on the new one, you just set the Y to -32 units to push it down. No biggie. That only took me like a minute or so. But just remember, in the future, if you're going to use the same approach that I did with the cloner tool, and you want to add interactions to each key, make sure you detach the instances first, then add the different states, and then add the events. Let's select the E key And let's add an event. So the trigger is going to be key down. As for the key, we're going to select E right there. So that's the trigger, key down. The action is going to be a transition. So we're going to transition clone 0, which in my case is the E key, from the base state to state. And I'm going to set a 0.1 second duration, ease in and out, no delay, repeat, and no loop. So let's check it out. Shift space, and I press E, and it works. But not quite. The key is just stuck there at the bottom. We need it to go back up. So then we need to do the reverse. We select the key, and we add another event that's going to use the key up trigger. The key is going to be also E, and we'll have a transition. But this time it's going to go in reverse. It's going to go from state, which is the press state here, to the base state. Same duration, 0.1. The rest is exactly the same. So let's check it out. I press E, so that works. I press E again, nothing happens, because the animation ran once. But we can make it so it repeats each time. We find that under mode. And we do that for both events, for the key down and the key up. So set the mode to repeat each time. So we preview, I press E, it works perfectly. I press and hold, the key stays down. I release it, and the key comes back up. Nice. Now it's simply a matter of doing the exact same thing for the other 5 keys. So I'm just going to demonstrate once more for the N key. We create a new event. Trigger is going to be key down. We set the key as N. We add a transition as the action. The target is clone 2, which is the group for my N key. I select the mode repeat each time. We transition from base state to state, to the pressed one. And we set the duration to 0.1. Then we add another event. The trigger is going to be key up, same key, transition again, make sure repeat each time. But this time, the transition will go from the pressed state to the base state. So the other way around, 0.1. So now, if I press the N key, that works perfectly. EN, EN. Great. So now, rinse and repeat for the rest of the 4 keys. And there's actually a faster way. You can select, for instance, the letter N, right-click, copy events, and then select the rest of the keys, right-click, paste events. So now we have the same events for all the other letters. However, they need to be tailored to the specific key. So for the V key, key down is going to be V, key up is going to be V, and also the transition needs to change as well, specifically the target. So I'm not targeting clone 2, I'm targeting clone 4. And for key up, again, we'll target clone 4. Letter A, we change the key here, we change the target. For T, we do the same. And for O, we do the same. All right, let's test it. V, E, N, A, T, O. And that's how you create an interactive 3D keyboard in Spline. Now, there's so much you can do with animations and interactions in Spline. Just look at this great scene I found on Envato. It features both an animation and an interaction. If I hover my cursor over these discs, they will shift their color and introduce this cool glow effect. Spline is a super capable app, and it's not that hard to learn, but it does take a little bit of practice to get used to it, and that's why I focused on so many exercises for this course. Now, let's do a quick recap of what we've learned so far. Spline allows you to work seamlessly with 2D and 3D objects, including transforming 2D shapes into 3D models. Parametric objects in Spline retain their original parameters, allowing easy creation and modification of basic shapes like cubes, spheres, and toruses. Moving, rotating, and scaling objects in Spline can be done very easily by using the gizmo that appears when you select an object. You can organize your objects in Spline effectively by using layers and groups to maintain a clean and manageable workspace. Materials in Spline bring 3D models to life by defining surface properties like color, shine, roughness, and transparency. Spline's material library offers a variety of options like wood, metal, and fabric, though some are paid assets. You can create custom materials by combining and adjusting different material layers. Lighting greatly impacts the appearance of 3D models in Spline. You can use different light types, directional, point, and spotlights, to create various lighting effects, with each type having its own properties for different scenarios. You can adjust light properties in Spline, such as shadows and reflections, by fine-tuning parameters like blur, which controls shadow softness, and penumbra, which controls the shadow's distance blur. The lighting material allows you to choose from 4 types of lighting for your objects: Lambert, which is matte without highlights; Fong, which has specular reflection; Physical, with more controls, ideal for metal and ceramics; and Toon, that's used for a cartoonish, non-photorealistic effect. Spline lets you create state-based animations that transition an object between 2 states, while also allowing you to add interactivity by triggering events like key up, mouse over, and look at. So this was just an introduction to Spline. Moving forward, I recommend you practice a lot and you build a lot of 3D stuff. Go ahead and experiment with all the tools and all the options that are available in Spline, and also check out the official documentation. This covers everything about the app, and it's neatly organized. Plus, you'll find explainer videos on most topics. Spline also offers a bunch of video tutorials explaining various techniques, so those are a great way of learning something new. As always, don't forget to check out the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more content like this, but also to learn about web design, web development, and much more. It's all free, so make sure to also hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. And just as a reminder, the 3D category on Envato now offers Spline assets, so go ahead and check that out. All right, that's it from me. I'm Adi. Time to sign off. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, take care.